Hello, I'm Jim Claypool, and welcome to this edition of Northern Lights. Northern Lights, you recall, is the program that focuses upon the accomplishments of people associated with Northern Kentucky University. It might be members of the community, students, faculty, staff, Board of Regents, or administration. And today my special guest is my colleague in the Department of History and Geography, Jonathan Reynolds. Jonathan, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me here today, Jim.
Well, Jonathan, you came to Northern in 1999, and
yes, indeed.
Actually you had an office that adjoined mine, and we got to exchange a lot of ideas and thoughts and visit with one another.
That's right, in the high status East Wing there of the History and Geography Department.
Yeah, well, I knew it was high status because the janitor cleaned our office at least once a month. But anyway, I want to go back and say something about where you're from, and I assume you grew up in Tennessee. You went to school at the University of Tennessee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I grew up mostly in East Tennessee, although I think my sort of life trajectory kind of defines me as somebody who was permanently not from around here. My family's actually all from Central Alabama, from around the Birmingham and Sylacauga area, but I was born in Boston while my parents were in graduate school. And then I lived in Germany for a while and then wound up in East Tennessee.
I'm not sure the people of East Tennessee were really ready for that kind of background.
Well, as I said, it resulted in an accent that isn't from anywhere. And so it doesn't matter if I go back to Boston or if I'm in Alabama, everybody looks at me and says, "You're not from around here, are you?"
Now, with that transient background, was your father in the military or something like that? Did his job cause him to move around a lot?
Well, that was part of the story. My father started out as a Methodist minister. And so that was, if you were a good boy from Sylacauga, Alabama, and you were going to leave town and go to school, there was only really one good reason to do that, and that was to go into the ministry. And so that sort of initial mobility came from the sort of, being a PK, a preacher's kid. But then he left the ministry and went into academia, and he's actually now a professor of religious studies at the University of Tennessee. And so the trip to Germany was his doing a year in residency at Heidelberg University.
What are your memories of that time in Germany?
I remember it being very cold, for one. But I do actually remember quite a lot of being in Germany. It was an interesting experience to be 3 years old, which is how old I was when I got there, and to be immersed in a situation where all your sort of peers spoke another language. And I'm told, actually, that by the time we left, I spoke excellent 4-year-old German. Although now all I can say is "Ein Bonbon bitte." Can I have some candy, please?
Always bitter.
Always bitter.
And then, of course, after you finished high school, you attended the University of Tennessee at Knoxville.
That's right. And because my father was on faculty at the University of Tennessee, and because my mother was a librarian in the public school system, I got a discount to attend the University of Tennessee, and so I was given very few choices for where I was going to go. But UT Knoxville did very well by me.
Studied history?
Yes, I was actually a hopeless generalist as an undergraduate. I actually went in thinking I was going to do either engineering or psychology, and very quickly found out that neither one of those was well suited to my strengths. And my history major was my first, but I wound up doing a triple major in history, anthropology, and a rather bizarre major called Ancient Mediterranean Civilizations, which was kind of like classics without the Latin or Greek.
Right. And then you got on to Boston University.
Mm-hmm. I took 1 year off. Actually, it took me 5 years to finish my undergraduate degree with the 3 majors. I have to admit, I was fairly burned out at the end of those 5 years. I took 1 year off. I managed a bookstore and realized that the sort of gray-collar world of retail management was not for me. And then I went on to Boston University in African history.
I have a real affinity with that. Many, many years ago, the school I attended, Center College, was a football power. Mm-hmm. And they scheduled Harvard, which in those days, the Ivy League was the number one league in football, mm-hmm. and Harvard was the number one team. And Center had played Harvard 2 games and been beaten, but in 1921, they played Harvard when they were ranked first in the nation, and actually upset them, beat them 6-0. And what reminds me of Boston University is the fact that the entire one side of the stands was filled with Boston University students who were rooting for my school because they were playing Harvard. And when Center won the game, which was a famous upset, 6-0, the entire stands poured out on the field and lifted the Center players in their shoulders.
That's
so
hilarious.
Boston University, of course, obviously there's a great rivalry between
There is
Harvard.
indeed. They're on two opposite sides of the Charles River right there. In the Boston side and the Cambridge side. And there's actually, with the African Studies program at Boston University, there's quite a rivalry with the African Studies program at Harvard. Because Boston University's program is much larger. We have a much better library, he said proudly. And that actually what happens is all of the African history doctoral students at Harvard come across the river and take all their core courses at Boston University. But then they go back and they finish with a Harvard degree.
Right.
So we always called them scammers.
And of course, your interest in archaeology and anthropology took you to the island of Crete one year.
Yes. Well, that was as an undergraduate, actually, and that was sort of an outgrowth of the major in ancient Mediterranean civilizations, although a fairly accidental outgrowth of it, actually. In that when I was a sophomore, actually, at the University of Tennessee, UT was then on the quarter system. And often the way that panned out was in the spring semester, you kind of had some extra space in your schedule. A lot of courses were 2 quarter sequences. And then in the spring, you kind of had some room to kind of play around. And a really big school like the University of Tennessee offers a lot of variety in classes. And I was just flipping through the course catalog looking for one more class to take. And there was a graduate seminar entitled Classical Archaeology of the Aegean. And that just sounded like fun. So I decided I was going to take a graduate seminar on classical archaeology in the Aegean as a sophomore. And so I enrolled in the course and I walked in. There were 8 graduate students and me and the faculty member. And the very first thing she said to me upon figuring out that I was a sophomore was, "You need to drop the class right now." And I decided just to stick it out instead, being rescued by my mom, who got me through the first week being a librarian. But as a result, I wound up doing quite well in the class and was offered the gig to work as a physical anthropologist on the archaeological dig on Crete, which was 3 summers, actually.
Yeah,
so
well, the reason I wanted to discuss that, because that brings out your personality. You're always up for an adventure.
Well, it's funny in that actually I started out being something of a homebody. And so I really, looking back on my adult life, and if you'd told me when I was 20 years old that I was going to wind up as an African historian and spend years living in West Africa, I would have thought that was just insane. And actually, the year before I went to Crete the first time, I had spent a month backpacking around Great Britain and had been horribly homesick. I was despondent by the end of the trip. I just missed home. And I was walking around and I was surrounded by strangers. I wasn't happy in the least by the end of that trip. And actually, the first summer on Greece, I was pretty homesick too. But after that, I kind of fell into a rhythm and actually was kind of surprised when the next year, when they asked me to go back to Crete again, I realized I was excited about the opportunity. And that actually resulted in a stretch of 11 years straight where I was outside of the country for some period of time every single year.
Well, as the audience has probably discovered, you're a multi-layered person. You're interested in such a diverse number of things. I mean, it's not just history, it's not just reading, it's not just travel, but it's African history and anthropology, and we'll talk more about your interest in music and many other things. And that's one of the first things that struck me when we met. Of course, I have a similar background. I'm interested in a lot of different things. And once you got through your graduate work, taking your PhD with a specialty in West African history, you became involved with Nigeria. And what happened there?
Well, when I entered into the graduate program at Boston University, actually, I came in on what's called a Foreign Language Area Studies scholarship, which is actually a strange little scholarship that had its beginnings in World War II, when the United States had interned Japanese American populations, but then realized that in the sort of thinking of the time, there were no trustworthy white people who spoke Japanese, and that this was a national security issue. And so the Foreign Language Area Studies program was created then to sort of expand language knowledge amongst a wider group of the American population. And so when I started at Boston University, these grants are now still a major source of funding for people doing graduate study in other parts of the world, be it Southeast Asia or West Africa or Central America. And Boston University is a major African studies program. But I wanted to study Ghana when I first started out, but they didn't teach Twi, which is the main language in Ghana. So I was given a choice of two West African languages, Bambara, which would take me to Mali, or Hausa, which would take me to Nigeria. And I chose Hausa. And so that set me on a sort of career trajectory to be a Nigerianist.
It's interesting, too, because when I took my studies, and when most historians that are now teaching studied, the emphasis, of course, was either American or European. The world aspect of teaching world history wasn't yet there.
Absolutely.
And our exposure to the African experience was through the colonial experience, rather than from the native point of view, learning the languages and the culture that long preceded the colonial experience.
Absolutely.
And when you got there, was that an issue that you ran into, this kind of backing away from the colonial experience into what was really a culture that preceded it?
Well, it's interesting that I came into sort of academia and higher education at a time when those perceptions were really changing. And it's been very heartening to see that process continue with my own students. My students today come in with a much better knowledge of Africa than I ever had when I was in high school or as an undergraduate. But within the field itself, there's certainly a great sort of consciousness of a need to sort of make a break with that colonial legacy and colonial perspectives on African history. So.
And you've written quite a bit in the area.
Well, I do like to write, and I started out focusing, it's typical of how careers sort of progress when you're a graduate student. They sort of, try and constrain you into a tight specialization as possible. So my doctoral dissertation and my first book was on politics in northern Nigeria from 1950 to 1966. And my dissertation advisor was very concerned that a period of 16 years was far too big, and I really needed to concentrate that down to maybe just a 10-year period.
Well, that's a typical dissertation advisor.
Absolutely.
Well, Jonathan, we need to take a brief break here, but I want to come back and talk about your interest in music and the work you've done here at the university, as well as the publications. And the program is Northern Lights. We need to take a brief break. Be sure to stay with us. We'll be right back. Well, welcome back to the program. The program is Northern Lights, and we're glad that you could stay with us. We were talking before the break to Jonathan Reynolds. Dr. Reynolds, of course, was my colleague in the Department of History and had a really interesting and varied background, having grown up in various places all over the United States as well as Europe, and taken his work at the University of Tennessee and Boston University with a specialty in West Africa, which drew you to first Greece and then later to West Africa, where you became a specialist. And then, Jonathan, after you decided to start teaching, you taught in Salisbury, North Carolina.
Beautiful, scenic Salisbury, North Carolina.
Which, of course, is Livingstone College.
Livingstone College.
And tell us something about that school.
Well, Livingstone actually has quite a history. It was founded immediately following the Civil War as one of what we now refer to as HBCUs, a historically black college and university. So it was part of the Freedmen's Movement. And so it was actually frequently referred to as the Harvard of the South in its early days. It was famous, actually, following the Harvard theme, but famous for its very intense sort of liberal arts and classical education. In fact, in the 1890s, the valedictorian of Livingstone College always had to deliver their commencement address in Latin. And so quite an interesting history for Livingstone.
A private school has a religious affiliation?
Yes, it's an AME Zion school. And it's actually one of my jokes after I got the job there, that since I was a middle-class Southern white boy who no less drove a pickup truck and who had wound up teaching African history, I often joked that it took an African-American college to be confident enough to actually hire me.
Yeah, you were a curiosity, no doubt.
Well, I was something of a curiosity, I have to admit, and I found out later on that my hiring had been something of a source of controversy within the sort of upper administration of the school. But I have to say, Livingstone was a wonderful school. I had a great time when I was there, and I really enjoyed it.
It's interesting. Kentucky State, of course, which is our traditional African-American school, if you look at the statistic enrollment numbers, it's interesting to find out that there are more white students than African-American students.
Right. That's typical of state-supported HBCUs, which have which tend to target a wider audience within the state population.
Now, your wife, of course, keeps a close tab on you, rightfully so. They're about the only one on this planet that can, I might add. And where did you meet her?
I actually met my wife in North Carolina. She was attending the University of North Carolina in Charlotte when we first met.
Okay, and did you now have a young child?
We have two young children.
Yeah.
We have a 2-year-old boy, and we also have a little girl who's 5 months old.
Of course, you've been banned because of a small illness. It's a
That's
bit
right.
contagious.
I'm in quarantine right now.
Yeah,
you can't tell on TV.
Sit out to the Marriott where you're...
That's right. I'm living in exile in a Marriott courtyard right now.
Sitting there pondering all the mysteries of life,
That's right.
and writing music. And,
that's right. I figure if I'm going to be stuck in a hotel room for a week, the least I can do is try and write a book chapter and maybe play some music.
It's definitely the theme of a song.
That's right. The Exile Blues.
The Exile
Marriott Courtyard Exile Blues.
Well, let's talk about your musical interests. When did they begin, Jonathan?
Oh, well, I grew up in a music house, and to that I have to credit my mom. My mom's always been a music person, and I grew up with music on in the house all the time, and a great diversity of music. We listened to jazz, and rock and roll was always on, and classic rock back when it was just rock. So there was always Beatles and Rolling Stones and Canned Heat playing, but also a lot of classical music, a lot of early jazz, a lot of Louis Armstrong and things like that. When I was 8 years old, I started playing cello, in part because we had a cello in the house. My brother had played cello for 2 or 3 years and then decided to stop, and there was just a cello sitting there. So when I was 8 years old, I started playing cello in the local school orchestra. Now, I played cello on into college, but I was never a very good cellist. I was a cellist outstanding in my mediocrity and my volume. And also, by the time I was 18, I had decided that a cello was not a great way to meet babes. So I had decided that the thing to start playing was guitar, which was more portable and had I thought, perhaps wrongly so, more appeal to women. And so I started playing guitar when I was 18 years old, and I've played ever since.
And you've been writing songs and recording songs.
Yes.
Tell us something about some of the work you've done on recording.
For years and years, I mostly just played and sang. I started out playing mostly folk music, actually, so I used to annoy people by playing Cat Stevens and James Taylor all the time. I was one of those people who always showed up at the party with a guitar. That's always to be feared, the person who brings their guitar to the party. But actually, I had something of an epiphany in my early 20s, and that was on two very close occasions, I heard somebody playing blues. And both times I was just really struck by it. And blues, we'd heard some blues, and a lot of blues-influenced music when I was a child, because all rock and roll is blues-influenced. But there was just something about it that hit me. And I happened to mention it to my manager at the bookstore where I was working, the same bookstore I later wound up managing. And she was a huge music fan, and she brought me a number of albums, and one of which was Booker White. And the recordings that had been done of him in the late 20s and early 30s. And I have to admit that I was completely floored by it. There was just something about the sort of intensity of the music. And also that it was edgy. It wasn't angry music, but it was music that really had a sort of oomph and edge to it. And at the time I said I was on a blues kick, but that was 20 years ago. And now I realize that blues sort of transformed me musically. So I've been a blues guy ever since.
So it's the feeling of the blues, the depth.
Yeah, the blues are deceptively simple. that the structure of the blues is very constrained by and large, that there's a 1-4-5 progression within a 12 bar. There are, of course, other versions of the blues, but that's the most typical. And that misleads a number of people to think of the blues as simple music. But the real power of the blues is that there's so much emphasis and so much emotion and so much freedom within the bounds that the structure creates.
It's kind of a scrolling consciousness of thought and feeling.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's just powerful stuff. Every music has power, and I don't want to privilege anything, but blues worked for me. And so, to make myself all the more stereotypical, middle-class Southern white boy who drives a pickup truck, teaches African history, and plays the blues. I mean, what could be any more strange?
Sounds like you were actually from Alabama or Mississippi, one of the two.
Oh, well, I got my Alabama roots.
Exactly, and we had a great experience one time. We went up to Chicago, and Chicago is, of course, the center for blues, and down on Rush Street, and some of those performers there.
Checkerboard Lounge.
Yes, absolutely, and they're classic. They are just absolutely classic. That's worth the price of admission, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, you ended up at Northern in 1999. How'd you get to Northern?
Well, I have to say, and it's still with kind of a degree of guilt that I left Livingstone College, because bless Livingstone for giving me a job. I needed one. And Livingstone was a wonderfully nurturing and encouraging environment for me, but the nature of a very small liberal arts college like that is that it is even more teaching intensive than an institution like Northern. I was on a 5-course load at Livingstone College, and there was a huge amount of administrative overhead that came in my job description there. I was the coordinator of the history and political science program, as well as teaching 5 courses, and there was simply no time to write. And that was really the issue for me at Livingstone. And so I was looking for a position that had more of a balance of teaching and scholarship, the ability to publish and write. And I was also looking for positions that were within a sort of 4 to 5 hour drive of Knoxville, because I'm very close to my family still, and I wanted to be within sort of striking distance of weekend visits. And it just so happened that Northern Kentucky University was one of the institutions I applied to that year. And bless NKU. I don't think it could have worked out any better for me.
And you came here, and of course we pandered to your interests, allowed you to teach world history and African history, correct. And of course you have taught European history as well.
That's right. Well, I kind of got snookered with that one.
Well, we all do. That's a given.
Well, that's a funny thing, too, because actually at the time, one of the jobs that came open that year, and there are never that many jobs in African history in a given year, was Clemson, which was, sort of fit within the sort of range of where I would apply, but that job was described as requiring teaching European history. And that kind of got my back up. I was like, it's absurd to ask an Africanist to also teach European history. I'm not going to apply for that job. Actually, a good friend of mine, James Burns, got that job instead. And then I came here, and I still got stuck with teaching European history for a year.
Well, I'm a European historian myself, and I suddenly found out I was a Kentucky historian. so we have these epiphanies from time to time.
And I have to say that actually it was a good thing for me to teach European history. Nothing teaches you more than teaching. Nothing teaches you more than teaching a class. You learn more in the course of teaching a class than you would ever learn as a student. And getting that sort of expanded insight and grasp of European history also helped make me a better world historian, because it provided me with that much more context and perspective.
There's a great irony in the training we receive as historians.
Oh, dear.
You specialize in a particular area. In your case, it's Africa. You come to an institution and with people who are intelligent, who are read, and who are dynamic. You have students who have interests and so on. But the bottom line is, who speaks to you about these little intricacies that you've studied and learned? You find a very small audience.
Absolutely. One of the bizarre things about academia is that we're all really trained to get jobs as graduate faculty at the kind of institutions where we got our graduate degrees. Certainly at Boston University, I was trained to get a job in one of the 8 African Studies centers in the United States. And of course, that means that, only about one Africanist in 100 would ever get the job they're actually trained for. And the reality is you wind up at a place like Northern Kentucky University, which is not a bad thing, let me tell you. But it means that you wind up teaching in a very different range of disciplines than you're actually trained for.
Right, and of course you've gotten involved in so many things here. You were awarded an award for being one of the top teachers here as a junior faculty member, and you work with the international students, and you also work with Phi Alpha Theta. We have just about a minute here, Jonathan. What is it about teaching that you enjoy the most?
Oh my goodness. I think more than anything else, it's an opportunity to sort of share the enthusiasm for the material and also the transformation, because, really, again, I never expected to wind up where I am today. And it was really the experience of traveling, it was the experience of reading new information, of learning about African history, which completely changed my perspective on the world. And I really think that if I can share some of that excitement and some of that expanded perspective with my students, then I just get to do something that is a privilege as well as a job.
Well, it's not hard to pick up on your personality, Jonathan, and I certainly appreciate you being on your program, and I know people will look forward to hearing you speak and also perform your music, and they'll read your books, and it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
That's our program for today. I'm Jim Claypool. The program is Northern Lights. Be sure to join us for the next edition of Northern Lights, and remember, Northern Kentucky University is your university.
Yay, KU.